Hello, welcome to the December special episode of TJ's Garden. I know I've been away for a while. This year has been a mess, and it's been a mess for everybody. I really hope you've made it through minimally scathed. I don't think any of us are making it through unscathed, but minimally scathed. The one thing about this year that has really made me feel better is seeing, when left to their own devices, people have gardened. That's something that has had a huge resurgence in this country, and indeed in many countries. I watch gardening programs in Australia and England. They've both had it. I've got friends online from Germany, France, Canada, Mexico, parts of South America, India. They've all taken back up gardening too, if they either never had or stopped. So that's all been really, really amazing. And let's face it, the sustained protests over this entire year against injustice have shown that people are way better than we might have given them credit for before. I mean, yeah, the people on the other side are people too. And they're going to have to come around. But a large group of good people is a good thing, even if there is a large or larger group of bad people on the other side. So yeah, I'm going to go into 2021 hoping it gets better, because I think everybody needs that. And so I thought I would help folks out who maybe have just started gardening this year, or maybe gardened for a little while and still haven't quite got the hang of it, kind of get ready for next year. Specifically, we're going to talk about seed. Saving seed is a really good practice. It's a really good way to adapt seeds to your area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Also generally about how to get your seeds actually started, what preparations, if any, you need, what materials you need, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So let's get to the stuff, and let's cut down the floweriness as much as possible. Buying seed. So if you are a gardener and you spend any amount of time buying seeds or anything else online, or anywhere else for that matter, you've probably gotten a ton of catalogs recently, or are in the process of getting a ton of catalogs. They send them out around December when we're all sitting in our houses missing our plants. So we'll see these gorgeous professional photos of plants at their Instagram best and run out and buy a bunch. That's really kind of what it is. Kind of like the same way grocery stores want you to shop when you're hungry. Seed catalogs get sent to your house when you haven't been able to garden for a few months. I say you, I don't mean me. I may not even mean you. If you're in a warm climate like me, you're still gardening. There's a lot less I have to do. It's cooler and wetter, so I don't have to deal with the heat as much, and I don't have to water as heavily. Weeds are down. They haven't really kicked back up like they do in spring. Pruning is up a little bit, removing dead plants mostly. So it's not intensive work. There are a few new plants, I plant. There's kale, things like that. But for the most part, winter is much slower, going right into the short period where it's basically non-existent, though. I'm going to have a good hard freeze probably by the end of the month. And the next, month or two, I'm not really going to be able to plant a whole lot. There'll still be a little activity out there because our winters aren't that cold. We do get a frost here. So, and then come about late March, early April is when I can start getting stuff in the ground again. I can get a few things in a little earlier that can tolerate a frost, but for the most part, planting new spring crops and summer crops, for me, that hits in about late March or April. Now here it gets weird because we have a few really warm days in February and early March. And often, I don't know a gardener in Bakersfield, my hometown, who doesn't do this. We all plant stuff once the weather heats back up again. And then we play the gamble of, are we going to have that mid-March hard frost that kills everything? I had black vernissage tomatoes, by the way, are one of the few tomatoes I planted during that period, because we all plant tomatoes, because tomatoes are like the mascot of gardening. I don't know why. Because I don't know why, because so many people don't seem to like them. Everybody likes the idea of a tomato, but when you actually bring in a bunch of tomatoes in the house, they'll sit there forever. The gardener is the only one who eats them. So I get those in the ground. And the black vernissage is the only one I've ever had that survives those hard frosts we sometimes get in March. So if you have frost problems, try black vernissage. So what all this means is this is prime time to start getting seeds in pots indoors or in a small greenhouse. I bought a small greenhouse online. It's not very big. I can't really even stand in it. I'm a fairly big guy though, so that may be more me. I had a bigger one, but it's the plastic kind, and those don't really survive our summers very well. So that one's now just a frame that I'm going to use for something. But the little one is ready for this winter, and I'm getting plants in there. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is when you're starting your seeds, try to keep in mind you want a month, 2 months before you're actually going to be ready to plant. So look up those late frost dates. You can find them. USDA's website has them. A bunch of other websites have them. Find it for your area, for your specific, not just your zone, but try to find it for your area. And when you find your last frost date for your town, city, state, yada, yada, then plan a good month or two before that. And that'll get you nice, strong transplants ready to go in the ground. Now, you don't really have to do this for some plants. Big seeded plants, beans, corn, you never want to do this for because corn takes very little time to sprout and it prefers really hot temperatures to do so. So you're actually going to want to do that later spring anyway. So planting corn this early usually doesn't do you any good. I planted some beans when I started my seeds just now, but I just did that to hit the ground running. You don't need to. Beans grow so fast, there's almost no point. But, a lot of your other plants, the staples, pretty much all the nightshades, so your tomatoes, your peppers, eggplants, if you're growing potato from true seed instead of actual seed potatoes, you can get those started early too. Those things benefit. Lots of plants benefit from being early. So look those up. Some of your salad crops do. Lettuce can, but lettuce grows pretty quick in the ground too, so it's kind of a toss up as to whether or not it's basically if you have space. A lot of your leafy greens, though, those do benefit from being started early indoors. Some of your alliums, although a lot of those you want to start in fall, grow out a little bit, let them hit that winter, and that helps them bulb up. So it's a mixed bag there as well. But broadly speaking, with most of your plants that benefit from getting an early head start, you're going to want to start those indoors a couple of months ahead, grow them out into a decent size and get them outdoors. So when I say start them, you're going to want to use a mix that doesn't necessarily have much nutrition in it, especially if you're going to prick out. So, and I'll go over what that is in a minute too for those who don't know. But the seed contains nutrition in it in most cases. One rare exception is like orchid seeds and some other seeds that, due to really weird, complex evolutionary relationships with other organisms, they don't need it. But the ones you're going to plant for fruits, vegetables, most of your ornamentals, they've got enough nutrition in that seed to get that plant up to the point of about its first couple of true leaves. So you don't really need anything in that mix. That mix can be really simple compost or, peat moss. Ideally not peat though. Ideally coca coir, but use what you can afford. And then something to help break that up. And this actually kind of gets to one of the weird things you'll sometimes see. You'll see a lot of gardening advice from the UK and some parts of Europe say gritty compost. And we all use vermiculite and perlite everywhere else, and they do there too to a degree. The difference is going to be weight. Vermiculite and perlite are expanded rock products. And so they are those they look like little packing foam balls that you see in your potting mixes. Well, those are actually rocks that have been expanded. It's two different kinds of rock. Vermiculite is a volcanic rock. Perlite is not. And the two basically have a lot of pore spaces inside of them, so they can hold a little bit more moisture. But the big advantage is they're lighter. So they help break up that organic matter, creating spaces, creating differences in the pore space, the space between different particles. Because they're different sized particles, they help to break that up. And it gives your roots easier areas to go through, helps keep moisture for longer while letting the excess moisture flow out better. And gritty compost that they use in the UK, they just use grit, which is just larger particle sand, and that actually is okay. I mean, it's not bad. It will make the material a little more dense. The bigger problem is it makes it heavier, which isn't a problem for seedlings, so go ahead and use it. But when you get into potted plants, especially larger potted plants, you start to have issues with weight. So I use gritty compost sometimes when I can afford it. And I say gritty compost. I don't even use grit. I use sandy compost, essentially, when I can't get a hold of vermiculite or perlite. If you can get a hold of them cheaply, that's great. If you can't, sand or horticultural grit basically just means it doesn't have anything in there that's going to hurt plants. If you can get a hold of those cheaper, that works too. Whatever gets you gardening. So you make your mix. Doesn't need a lot of nutrition. Needs a little bit of organic matter. Kind of hold it together. Needs something like vermiculite, perlite grit to help lighten it up and break that organic matter up and allow drainage, but also hold on to what actually stays behind and make it accessible to the plants. Essentially, that's a big benefit. When you hear, because it sounds so contradictory when you hear somebody say, I want good drainage, but also good retention. It's because when you water something, that first bit of water runs right through, and some portion of that remains behind, and that's what's your long-term water supply for your plants. It's what's bound up to those particles. And so when you have mixed pore sizes, that means that that initial wash of water drains through smoothly. It doesn't get caught up anywhere. It doesn't stay or get stagnant or nasty. But then the stuff that actually remains behind, if you have a good material that's nice and porous and holds on to that, organic matter is also, by the way, really great at this. It's basically a sponge. That'll hold on to your water, and that gives your plants then access to the clean water with plenty of air space in between and everything else that it needs. Right, so that's all I need to say about mix for now. So there are specialty mixes you'll need for different plants sometimes, but that's the big thing. But so you get the mix right, you get your plants seeded, get them in front of some sunlight. In truth, though, you can actually, you can basically look at the germination length, like how long it takes that plant to germinate. And if it's something that takes like a week or so, you can actually keep that somewhere relatively dark so long as it's sufficiently warm for it to actually germinate. They don't need the sun until they actually get out there, at least for most food crops. And this is where you get into seed dormancy. In plants that we have heavily domesticated, seed dormancy isn't really a huge thing. You give that plant a moist environment, it will sprout. Even if it doesn't actually have any of the other stuff it needs to live, it'll still sprout. That's true for pretty much any crop plant. If you put corn in a moist environment, stick it in your fridge. This is how we actually test seed. You stick it in your fridge on a moistened towel in a plastic bag, and it'll sprout just fine, even though there's no soil or anything useful for it there. It'll shoot out a root. It's a little radical, and I love how they call roots radical too. It's radical. The root of the plant will sprout out, take onto the, whatever growing medium is available, in that case, a paper towel, and seem to start going through the motions, even though it has nothing it actually needs. Plants that have not been modified by humans over generations and generations and generations to help remove those traits still have dormancy traits. And so those plants will only grow when they get enough sunlight on the seed, enough moisture, sometimes when they detect the presence of certain chemicals in the soil around them, sometimes when they only detect, in the case of orchids, like I was talking about earlier, when they detect certain symbiotic fungi, because what they do immediately is they put that radical out and it forms a relationship with the fungus, and the fungus feeds the orchid at first. That's how it starts. They've developed a sort of relationship where the orchid parasitizes the fungus instead of bringing its own food along in its seed. That means orchid seeds are these tiny little spore-like things that fly forever because they don't carry anything with them but the little embryo ready to go. And so when they land on a fungus, they pick up chemicals in the fungus, realize they're in the right spot, and those seeds germinate. They form a relationship with the fungus feeds them, they grow big, they start photosynthesizing. Eventually there's some symbiosis with the fungus, although there are a few species that actually are functionally parasitic, but that's their whole life cycle. But most plants that we've domesticated aren't like that. They will grow no matter what. And so you don't actually need to do a lot of the processes you'll hear about. Some of them will speed up germination, but they aren't required for germination. That's true of domesticated plants. That's not true of some of our ornamentals or plants that have just recently been brought into domestication, like a few wild food plants that people have started growing, things like that. So basically, you should need to look up for the plant you're growing whether it needs these things. But generally speaking, if it is a food you recognize, broccoli, cabbage, those are all the same species, corn, tomatoes, beans, lentils, any major crop that you recognize, those have probably had their dormancy restrictions removed over generations and generations. Foods you wouldn't necessarily recognize, but have also been in domestication in other parts of the world, like, say, taro root. Taro root's a little different because they mostly vegetatively do that, but those generally are also in the same boat. an exception to all that is fruit trees, because we haven't actually, they have longer life cycles. We usually clone them. So there hasn't actually been a lot of work in truly domesticating them, right? We get a few traits we like and we just copy that tree 100 times. So their seeds often do require these. And so the methods I'm talking about, again, only necessary if you're growing specifically ornamentals that need them or wild type plants that need them. Scarification, that can be actually notching or scratching up the seed coat. You can do it chemically with like a very low solution of hydrogen peroxide can do it. You just let them soak for a little bit in like, I think it's 1 to 10% hydrogen peroxide is about all you'd need. You can also put them through a few other, sandpaper. It's basically just there to soften or crack up or weaken that seed coat and let the moisture in, let chemicals in that'll trigger germination. Another thing that's sometimes done is sometimes you have to smoke seeds. So you actually have to expose them to a lot of smoke. This is especially true of Australian and California natives who oftentimes only germinate after forest fires. So basically you just create a little smoker. You can use, in a lot of cases, you can use most smoke as long as there's some wood and some other plant material. The right chemicals will be there. Also, some plants benefit from soaking. That's also true of a lot of domesticated plants too, because, we dry them so they last longer. But then they need that moisture to get started. And so some plants actually do benefit from an overnight soaking. I usually don't soak plants unless I'm worried about germination if I'm using older seed, which is something I'll get to in a little bit too. So in my case, I don't need to do all the soaking or anything else in most cases, but if I'm growing, say, tomatoes from a year or two ago, I'll probably soak those. Another thing is stratification. So stratification is taking your plants and putting them in a cold environment. And those are plants that have a dormancy related to winter. So they need to experience a chill. And so those seeds you'd stick in your freezer for a couple of days and pull out and then plant out in your area and they'll grow just fine. But they need that cold snap to tell the seed that a winter has occurred. It's spring, get going. Some bulbs require this as well. A few other plants, pretty much anything that generally does its thing early spring. Those are often the plants that have a winter dormancy requirement. And then I think that's all the ones I was going to talk about there. Yeah. So let's go on to how to get the seeds. This can be very easy or very, very complicated. Depends on what kind of seeds you want, how badly you want them, how much you've got to spend, who you know. A bunch of other factors, pretty much the same factors as anything else in life. So you can go down to your local 99-cent store, whatever, during the right part of the year. They'll probably have seeds, probably very cheap seeds, probably seeds that will grow just fine. It'll be from a handful of very common varieties, probably not actually hybrids, probably open pollinated varieties because those are cheaper to produce. So, you'll be able to get like a tomato or an eggplant or, a lettuce. But you won't really have a huge amount of choice necessarily. Some of those seeds, they're not old seed. Most seed companies will not sell you stuff from last year. That said, 99-cent store sometimes gets the seed lots that are close to the edge of when they can really sell them. But they're usually still pretty viable. I haven't actually had a problem with them. I bought packs of them before. It's not a problem. Same thing with most your grocery stores, things like that. So if you're not looking for variety or very specific things in your plants, if you just want to grow some vegetables or some flowers, they're great sources. They're cheap. It's easy. There's probably a lot of social issues relating to why they're cheap, and those probably aren't very good. But if you're broke enough that is a huge benefit to you, there are societal issues as to why you're broke too. So I'm not going to judge anybody for that. That said, supporting local or small seed companies is hugely beneficial just to stewardship of seed varieties. Having people who are growing local to you, so you know that the seeds are viable in your area and they're growing varieties that you want in your area, and they're more responsive to you because they're local and they're smaller and they need to be responsive to their customers. Here in California, we have a company, San Diego Seed Company. I order from them a bit. They don't have a huge variety, but everything I buy from them grows because San Diego's climate is more coastal and they don't really have a frost. And we tend to have hotter summers and we do have a frost, but they're within a close enough range that I don't have problems with seed coming from there. So I buy from San Diego Seed Company all the time when I can. I buy from Baker Creek. They have a huge variety. They're very focused on providing as many varieties as they can. And those, though, they do buy from sometimes other countries in their recent catalog that was released. By the way, I bought their big bonus catalog. Don't buy it if you just want to buy seeds from them. There's almost nothing in that catalog that isn't elsewhere. And they don't advertise it that way. So I'm not trying to imply they're being deceptive. I'm just saying that you as a buyer might not realize the free catalog they send out and the website have everything the Big Fancy catalog has. The Big Fancy catalog has amazing pictures, has longer articles and stuff in there. So it has more information about who's growing what, yada, yada. There's a little of that in the smaller catalog. So you're really just paying for the premium catalog experience. I don't regret it. It's pretty. I enjoy it. But the free catalog they sent me right after has most of the same varieties and the website has all of them. So yeah, a few companies will sell you a big fancy catalog. Just be sure you know what you're paying for. And most of them that I've dealt with, at least, are honest about that. But anyway, Baker Creek is a decent source. They get a lot. They do engage in some anti-GMO advocacy that I'm not super fond of, but considering their whole focus is heirloom and open pollinated varieties, some of that's gonna happen. Like you can't live your whole life focused on those and not develop a sort of rivalry, I guess, with other systems. I'm going to talk about genetic modification a minute too. It's complicated, but anyway, they're a good source for seeds. Seed Savers Exchange is a nonprofit. They have a huge variety of seeds. Also, if you become a member, which I actually got a membership for Christmas, so I'm becoming a member when I get my little packet. They have all kinds of programs behind the scenes. You can really play with some cool experimental stuff if you want to get involved. And their memberships aren't ridiculous. So that's a great source as well. I'm trying to think of a few others. Obviously, Johnny's Select Seeds is a good source if you need bulk seed. They carry both open pollinated and F1 varieties. And I'll get to a little talk about what different varieties of seed are in a minute. But they're a good source. Trying to think of some others. But even if all you can do is order from a big company like Burpee or something because of the prices or whatever, do what you got to do. Just if you can support these companies that actually put a lot of work into their seed and focus on continuing to be able to sell you those seeds, and especially focus on open pollinated seeds, which means they're basically selling you a product that they don't necessarily expect to be able to sell you again, right? If I save all my seed from all my plants, I don't have to buy from Baker Creek again, right? Because I have all those plants. Unless they come out with something new I want, I'm good. So because they're doing something like that inherently means they may get less support, we kind of need to support them more. But anyway, that's enough about where to get this fun stuff. Oh, no, it isn't. Where to buy this fun stuff. Let's talk about other ways to get this fun stuff. Okay, so seed swaps offline are off, but online are on. You can still go to, there are a lot of groups on different social media platforms. You can find some on some websites. There are a lot of online seed swaps. The Seed Savers Exchange membership I just mentioned, they have a seed swap program, and I don't actually think you have to be a member to participate in some of that. I think you have to be a member to participate in the fancier side of that, but just broader, getting some seeds for some seeds. I think you could do that. There's some free seed programs in some cities. Some libraries have seed libraries where you can pick up or drop off seeds. Some private people actually have those out in front of their houses too, kind of like those little free libraries. So there are ways to get free seed that way as well. You can also just find, different. One great way to get seeds for completely free is to look online and see if you qualify for any programs that do seeds. The Native Seed Search is a group that The Native Seed Search is a group that focuses mostly on native food crops and native seeds. They also grow some others that have been popular over the years, but their big focus is on native foods for native peoples of the Southwest. Now, I can go on there and buy corn, buy seeds, buy whatever. I can engage in their membership programs. I can do all their stuff. But if you are an indigenous American who is either living in the Southwest or who is from a tribe or nation in the Southwest, and they're very broad about what constitutes the Southwest. They also count northern Mexico and some other areas. You can get free seed from them, a certain amount, depending upon your situation. So look that up. Go to their website, the Native Seed Search. I will put a link in the show notes. They have a program for that. They also have a program for like schools, and that's another thing. If you're part of a school program or a nonprofit that's growing seeds for a community garden or anything like that, a lot of seed companies that I've already mentioned have free seed programs, so check into those. And there are a few other charities floating around that I probably don't know about that run similar schemes that you can get free seed if you're considered marginalized or if you have any issues getting seed. So there's a lot out there if you're willing to just spend the time digging through it and finding these little niche programs that can help you out if you need that help. And there's nothing wrong with taking that kind of help if you need it. That's why they're there. So go out there and look for those as well. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of some of the buzzwords I've just thrown out about what different plant varieties are. So you have open pollinated, which is big tent term, and it just means any plant that has been allowed to be pollinated semi-naturally. So you grow one variety, that variety pollinates with itself, either through the air, through insects, or even manual transmission, i.e. you sit there with a Q-tip and you move pollen from plant A to plant B. All that is open pollinated. And so those plants will produce seeds that are similar to them because the plants that they cross with are similar to them. In the case of some legumes, some of the nightshades, a few other plants, they're self-fertile. So quite often, unless something actually does interseed at just the right time, like a bee moves pollen at just the right time or whatever, they will pollinate themselves. And so they're technically open pollinated, even though they're basically crossing with themselves, becoming fairly genetically homogeneous in the process, and producing offspring that are pretty similar to them. So that's what open pollinated is. Heirloom is a narrower category. It's defined a lot of different ways. Some people go with a very general seed that's been handed down, like any other heirloom, which I'm okay with that definition, but a better, more specific usually cuts off heirlooms as open pollinated varieties before 1945. With the exception of a few that are developed, in little communities somewhere outside of commercial agriculture that have been developed a little after that. And the reason why they do that as a cutoff is because that's when hybrids were introduced. So before that, people practiced simple selective methods and, basically pick the seeds from the plants that did the best for them last year to do the best for them next year. They occasionally crossed when they found a trait they really liked somewhere else, but for the most part, these were homogeneous populations kept over the years. And then you have the introduction of hybrids and other breeding techniques, and suddenly those populations start mixing around, diversifying, changing a little bit. So if you want a Cherokee purple tomato, that's an heirloom. If I make a modern tomato variety, but it's self-fertile, it crosses with itself or whatever, and it's able to be maintained over years as a variety, it comes true to type. That's an open pollinated variety just because it's recent. So that's the main dividing line. I like the 1945 definition. I'm okay if it's the handed down definition. I will not argue with somebody who's like, well, my grandma gave me these seeds and her grandma gave her those seeds and so on, even if the variety isn't one that's been recognized since the 40s. I'm okay with that. I'm also not the boss of you, so you can call whatever you want an heirloom. I'm not your dad. Landrace. So you have open pollinated, but many open pollinated varieties are kind of like show dogs. They're a little bit inbred. A landrace is where It's just a large population that has sometimes a lot of variety in it that's been picked for a handful of traits that are important to you. But you don't want every plant to be the same, and you don't want even the products to necessarily all be the same. Maybe you just want a field of squash, and you don't care what the squash looks like, as long as it tastes decent, it's edible, it's ready within certain parameters, plants grow to a certain size, etc., etc. Whatever factors are important to you are the only things you're worried about, and you're not worried about homogeny. That's a landrace. I've tried my hand at it. I was trying to grow a landrace of okra for a little while at my job before I got laid off. And so for 3 years, I just grew a bunch of okra together, picked the ones I like. And I was trying basically to create a spineless variety that still had a lot of diversity, but tended to have larger pods. I didn't want loads of pods. I just wanted fewer, bigger pods, if that makes sense. And there were already varieties out there that did that kind of, but I was using those as a base. I wanted all the other traits for those plants to be as diverse as possible, so I didn't have to worry about pest problems, diseases, so on, running through the population, because that can be a problem in other open pollinated varieties that are more inbred, essentially. A lot of heirloom tomatoes have that problem because they are very fixed for traits. One heirloom tomato is almost genetically identical to another because they self-pollinate over many, 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 many generations. So by genetic drift, all the diversity in that first plant, because that plant crossed with itself, and its offspring crossed with itself, and its offspring crossed with itself, and its offspring crossed with itself, and so on and so forth, eventually genetic drift just gets rid of a lot of the variety, and they become very, very, very homogeneous. They aren't actual clones, but they're pretty close to it genetically. And so land races give you that variety, and other open pollinated varieties don't. Sometimes give you the inverse of that. So just be aware if you want to play around in kind of backyard breeding, that's something to be very, very clear on. However, there are hybrid varieties, and those are what started in the 40s, and they're pretty predominant in agriculture now. And I'm going to say something very, very controversial. Hybrids aren't a bad thing. I mean, they can be. One reason why a lot of seed companies, commercial seed companies, focus on hybrids is because traditional seed breeding is not very profitable. A lot of your favorite varieties of heirloom seeds and open pollinated seeds were not bred by a commercial seed breeder, and that's all he does. These were side projects of farmers, nurserymen, hobbyists. The entire dwarf tomato project and the new micro dwarf tomato project both came out of hobbyists. Craig Hillier is not a tomato farmer. He's not a commercial tomato breeder. He's just a guy who liked his tomatoes and wanted to play around with them. And he got a bunch of other people to do that. I did an interview with him. I'll link to that, but basically, it was all amateurs. It wasn't a commercial enterprise at all. And it's produced many, many, many varieties, still producing varieties. Most of what I grew this year were dwarf tomato varieties. They're awesome. And they came entirely out of people just trying it. But they aren't profitable to develop those things. In, just the way economics works, actually coming up with innovations isn't itself profitable, right? If I make a better transportation system, or a better tomato, or a better house, that in and of itself is not profitable. If I can turn that into a product I can sell and market, and that has certain commercial viability, and I can get all the other ducks in a row, and I can get legislators on my side, and I can get, all the right laws in place, and right people in the right places, and everything else, then yeah, I can make a lot of money. But more likely, I will make a little money, maybe, selling it to somebody who's set up to do all that already. They'll do that, and they'll make the lot of money for a little while, because when you have something that comes true to type, people don't have to buy from you again. And so an F1 variety means they have to buy from you again. But all F1s are, when you're talking about within a species, when you're talking about, outside of a species, when you're talking about, multiple species or species outside of the same genus, things like that, those are different hybrids. When you're talking about within the species, right? So 2 tomatoes, what they do is they breed 2 varieties of tomato that are probably terrible tomatoes. They don't have to be good. because that's not what you're doing. You're getting all your traits lined up in one variety and all your traits lined up in another variety. And you're playing with those little Punnett squares we all had in school. You know, if the mom has these two genes and the dad has these two genes, what will the kids have? You're doing the very complex version of that. And you're breeding these two lines that have just the right traits. So every time you cross them, you get a sun gold. You get a green boar F1. You get any of the other F1 varieties out on the market right now. And that is kind of cool. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of cool. It's expensive because you have to develop two lines which, again, as I said, in and of themselves aren't profitable. You have to keep those lines secret because if anybody else got those two lines, they can make the same hybrid you do. So you have to keep those lines protected. You have to keep them homogeneous. So you have to keep breeding those lines to keep having the exact same plants. And then once you've done all of that, you have to have people hand pollinate everything because you can't easily make a tomato not pollinate with itself or make other plants not pollinate with themselves unless you're lucky enough to have male and female. Corn hybrids are slightly easier. That's when you hear about detasseling and things like that. But that's still some guy, because machines aren't great at doing this, going out there and cutting all the tassels off of an entire field of corn. It's time consuming. And so that's why they're all a little more expensive than other varieties. But when they sell you a sun gold tomato, you don't get more sun gold tomatoes without buying them again next year. There's a trick to that I'll get in a minute. There's actually kind of a way to go around all this, hack the planet. But in theory, I can't make my own sun gold tomato seed. I can take the seed from the sun gold tomato and grow it, but I'm just going to get a semi-random mix of the two parents. It might be a little more mom or a little more dad because that sun gold probably pollinated itself. And so in that mix, because of genetic drift, it's not going to be 100% 50-50 those two original parents. It's going to be a certain amount mom, a certain amount dad, selected at random. So I don't know what I'll get. And there is such a thing as dehybridizing, which is where you do that and then you keep growing them and you keep crossing and crisscrossing them and selecting offspring, trying to find a variety that has most of the traits of that sun gold. And once you've created one that breeds true, and there are a couple of dehybridized sun golds, they're not as popular as sun gold, but they exist. Then you've created a true dehybridized line. But yeah, hybridized lines prevent you from growing seed. Now, the hack I was talking about is this, and it only works for some of them. Tomatoes specifically can be propagated from cloning. At my last job that I mentioned, I grew the same exact sun gold tomato plant for 3 years because towards the end of the first year, I took some cuttings and I grew them in the greenhouse. And then I grew them back out the next year. And then at the end of that year, I took some cuttings and I grew them in the greenhouse and I grew them back out the next year. Now, when we're talking about genetic diversity, this does nothing for that. These are all clones, but it does allow you to have that hybrid tomato you really liked for years and years and years without having to buy hybrid tomato seed every year. It's a little bit of work, but you know, a lot of times you're trading your work for somebody else's work. And so that makes it cheaper for you in theory, but obviously more labor intensive. Now, obviously that's not going to work on an annual plant. It's not even going to work well on a biennial plant. So it's only going to work on things that are maybe, longer lived perennial plants that we grow for a shorter amount of time, like a tomato, things that can be cloned. So why is genetic diversity a thing? Well, in the hybrids, keep in mind, I told you they're focusing certain traits down to a razor's edge and then crossing them, but they're not focusing all the traits. So actually, when they do genetic tests, F1 hybrids can be more diverse than heirloom varieties because the heirloom is self-pollination, 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 all the way down the line. Whereas the hybrid has that hybrid moment where two not necessarily closely related lines are crossed back together. And even though they fix them to a razor's edge for some of the traits, yield, shape, color, etc. of the fruit, some leaf traits, some growth traits, they haven't fixed them for anything else. And this also, they're also going for traits that when they cross, create that beloved hybrid vigor. There are a lot of traits you can kind of keep in an organism that will cause it when you cross them to grow much more aggressively, right? This is how we get ligers. The downside is a liger eats way more than the other animals. So hybrids can sometimes require more resources to grow, but they do perform way better too. And sometimes the economy balances out there. Sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, hybrids aren't evil. I feel like they do get misused a lot. I think it would be cooler if there was more of a sort of hacker community figuring out ways to develop their own hybrid lines. That could be really interesting. So yeah, I think the motives behind them sometimes are bad. I don't think the technology is inherently bad. And I think that same thing about the next topic, genetically modified organisms. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, as a gardener, with the exception of maybe corn, you don't really need to worry about genetically modified organisms. You can't afford them, and you probably can't get them. The very few that are actually on the market, there aren't that many genetically modified plants in food production right now, are very specific use cases. They're only sold in certain places. You have to have licenses. It's a thing. Corn is a little different because some modified corn has gotten into non-modified supplies. It's not a lot, but it has turned up a few times. And that's why when you see something like Baker Creek or some other group that promises their food isn't, or their plants aren't genetically modified, they actually have to go do genetic tests on samples of their corn to make sure it hasn't snuck into their process. Now, usually these are older genetically modified varieties. And so if you go back to that fun interview I did with Sebastian Kochoba, I always mispronounce his last name, Sebastian, the gene hacker. He was pointing out that, a lot of the gene gun type stuff goes into the mitochondria and other organelles that don't get transferred by pollen. So there's no way for a GMO plant made in that fashion to pollinate a non-GMO plant and get something with those GMO traits. What has to happen is you have to have gotten seed from a GMO plant at some point. And you'd think, does that mean all these farmers are out there stealing? No. What's happened is granaries have screwed up and had a few stray bits of corn fall from one bin into the wrong bin. A few cases of corn falling off the side of a truck and landing in some farmer's field. And he happens to be a farmer who does some degree of corn breeding himself. So he saves seed, not realizing it, or in at least one case, actually realizing it. And that's where you get these weird lawsuits from Monsanto that seem so one-sided. They kind of are. I'm not going to say those lawsuits are totally justified. In at least one case I know of, they're completely unjustified. The farmer had absolutely no clue what was happening, and he didn't want GMO corn in his supply. He countersued because he was going to have to destroy a lot of his supply. There was another one, though, where it turned out he had actually intentionally grabbed the corn, figuring he could breed his own. So it's a mixed bag. It's a mess. But that's not because the technology is evil. That's because we put bad motives behind how we use it, and because the laws surrounding it are a mess of patent and copyright law being misapplied. It's something that needs to be fixed. But the upside of all of it is it's something that does not really affect your average home gardener. I'm not going to get a new leaf potato by accident. I'm not getting genetically modified eggplant from India on accident. That's just not going to happen. If you want to play around with genetic modification, you can listen to that interview I did with Sebastian. You can go follow his stuff he's on Facebook. I think he's on Twitter, Instagram, yada, yada. It's a Tiny Green Cell on Instagram. I'll post links in the show notes. You can follow his stuff. He'll show you some of it. He has open notebooks. He's now actually selling some slight modification materials on Etsy, which he's double checked and made sure was totally legal to do, because they're not something that can actually hurt you on their own. Like, you need to have the right tools. You need to know kind of what you're doing on your own. If you get exposed to an organelle that are, a little basically loop of DNA that they insert into these organelles, plasmid is what it's actually called. If you get exposed to that, that's not going to hurt you. It can't get into you on its own. So it would require a hugely long comedy of errors for anything he's selling to hurt you. And that's what genetic engineering technology kind of is we blow it up to be this big thing. And like a lot of things, it boils down to there are bad motives sometimes involved in the process that cause it to go weird, right? Weird profit motives, companies competing over things that don't necessarily matter to the rest of us and stuff like that. But overall, the tech itself is just kind of cool. Who doesn't want glow-in-the-dark tomatoes? I do. Anyway, though, you can't get them. You can't have them yet. And who knows when you will. So don't worry about genetic modified food in your seeds. You're not likely to be able to get them. If you have the ability to get them, you probably know enough to control whatever you're dealing with. So I don't have any advice for you. But for the average home gardener, it's not really a problem yet. It may be, but it isn't now. So go ahead and buy your seeds with impunity. And go listen to my other episode. That was a really cool interview. It was fun. The other fun thing is seedless varieties. To clarify, you can buy seed for a seedless watermelon. It's because, again, they're hybrids. So we bred them so that when they cross, they produce a variety that's seedless. In the case of other plants, though, sometimes their seedlessness comes from other things. A seedless cucumber, for instance, is actually bred to have traits that make it seedless if it's not pollinated. So it will produce a fruit and produce those little white useless seeds that don't really matter. And you get a seedless cucumber, which is pretty nice. But if that pollinates, then because some of the genes around its seed production are actually kind of broken, you don't just get the bitter shell around the seed. The whole cucumber goes kind of bitter. So if you want to grow seedless cucumbers, you have to grow them contained, like in a greenhouse or something. And you grow all female varieties, and you don't let anything near them that might pollinate them. And you get seedless cucumbers. But there's no elaborate genetic modification going on. It's just basically breeding, conventional breeding techniques and using weird mutants for our own benefit, which I think is always kind of cool. So I'm going through just a little bit more because I want to talk about reading your seed packets. I'm just going to talk about tomatoes and beans because they tend to be the most complicated, but some of this applies to all of them. So in tomatoes, you'll see indeterminate, semi-determinate, determinate. Less often, you'll see dwarf, micro-dwarf. Sometimes you'll see jointless. That overlaps with a lot of them. You'll see some other traits as well. If you go to the Heinz 57 Ketchup Company, a big side business for them is that they sell 57 varieties of tomato that they sell commercially to growers who grow them and sell the tomatoes back to Heinz to make your ketchup. That's where that Heinz 57 comes from. I think there are actually more than 57 varieties in their catalog right now. But if you go through that catalog, they will have a list of traits a mile long, and you don't actually need to know any of those. But the big one good one is jointless, which I'll go over in a minute. Anyway, indeterminate tomatoes grow the way natural tomatoes grow. They just keep growing and keep putting on flower clusters off to the side of their branches in little leaf axils as they grow. You tend to either let them sprawl or prune them down to 1, 2, 3 liters, depending upon how you're actually going to trellis them and trellis them up. When you hear about suckers are not new plants like people say. You can use them to make a new plant. You can propagate them, but they are in fact side branches. And they grow in a big sprawl, right? And we generally prune them to 1 or 2 liters to help keep them manageable and producing fruit rather than just bushing out into ridiculous size. And also to give that fruit access to better airflow, better warmth. They don't really need the sun. People say, let the sun ripen them. The sun doesn't ripen your fruit. The heat does. So you want the heat within certain manageable temperatures. You want good airflow. You want access to pick and harvest without damaging the plant. That's why we do it. But you pick those side shoots and let them grow on 1 or maybe 2 or 3 liters up a pole or a trellis or whatever. But that's an indeterminate tomato. It'll just keep growing until the weather kills it. And in a warm enough climate, I know a few folks down in San Diego who've done this a few years, but you can pull it off anywhere you don't really have a frost. Tomatoes can grow through a winter and keep growing 2-3 years. So can a lot of pepper varieties. They're not really annuals. They just produce well enough on their first year that we grow them as annuals. But they can survive for 3 years without a frost, which is also why you can clone indeterminate tomatoes by taking cuttings. Determinate tomatoes have a very fixed life cycle. A mutation showed up, I want to say it was actually in the 40s as well. 20s or 40s, something with an even number. I'll if I remember to, I'll post it in the show notes. I'll look it up. But basically, in a field somewhere, a tomato showed up that grew, produced all of its fruit, and then died. And it was the weirdest thing at the time. What it had was a pattern called determinate growth. The genes that told it where to put its fruit cluster screwed up and told it to put the fruit cluster at the end of a stem. In the wild, this might be a problem. There may be advantages because there actually are in the wild determinate plants. An agave is a determinate plant, for instance. It just side buds enough that you don't really notice, because once that main rosette dies, all the other rosettes start growing. In this case, though, the whole plant is determinate at once. And so the plant will grow to a specific size, hence determinate. It will put fruit clusters out at the end of its stem, so it will start flowering and then go to fruit. The fruit will all mature within roughly about the same time, and then you harvest them all, and the plant's done. And determinate growth is very handy for the canning industry, for producing certain fruits, because you plant your crop and you don't know exactly. You know roughly when it's ready, and it's all going to be ready at once. So there isn't the continued picking and dealing with big periods of boons and periods of little lulls and growth patterns. It's all consistent. It's all, you plant it now, you wait a certain amount of time, you harvest, you're done. So it's very, very convenient for commercial farming. It's not super convenient for a lot of home usage. A lot of us just want tomatoes throughout the season. So determinate varieties tend to be paste varieties when you talk about home gardening. But when you talk about commercial growth, a lot of your beefsteaks are determinate varieties when they're commercially grown, because they can grow them in Florida. They grow them on a schedule. They stagger it, so you have a continuous supply of tomatoes growing. When you have acres and acres and acres of land, it works out in a way that, keeping a continuous supply of indeterminate tomatoes over the course of a year wouldn't be as convenient. So yeah, it's good for some things, but definitely make sure you know what you're getting, so you're not going to sit there expecting tomatoes all year round and you get them all in one big glut and then the thing dies, because that's what they do. Dwarf tomatoes are not synonymous with semi-determinate. So a semi-determinate tomato is somewhere between the two, right? It's either a determinate tomato that really grows and sprawls out a lot more, or it's an indeterminate tomato that stays relatively small. They usually do it by shortened internodes, but a dwarf tomato is structurally different. When you see a dwarf tomato, you know you're looking at a dwarf tomato. The stem is much thicker than you'll see on a normal tomato for its size. Even a semi-determinate that seems about the same size as dwarf, right, that just stays within about 4 feet or so in height, when you look at the stems, they look like normal tomato stems. They aren't thick like a dwarf. So dwarfing is a trait. And the Dwarf Tomato Project has introduced that trait into a wide variety of tomatoes. And they're awesome. I love them. They're very space efficient. You don't have sprawling tomatoes everywhere. You have a little 4-foot tall bush. It needs some staking from the weight of the fruit, but it doesn't need an elaborate trellis system. You don't have this thing sprawling all over your yard. It's a nice, convenient plant. It's really handy if you have small space like I do right now. It was really handy. Well, I didn't get to grow them at work, unfortunately. I was just about to start, but I was growing roughly 20 or so varieties in a large bed we had, just so the kids could get the experience of a lot of different types of tomatoes in one small space. But that would have been way easier with little dwarf plants. As it was, it became a huge tangle. I couldn't say you find this tomato here. They would sometimes have to look in the other bushes because it would grow out into them. Sometimes a variety would smother another variety and it would just die. So being able to grow little convenient 4-foot tall bushes of all the different tomatoes would have been way easier. And then grow a couple of other growth types just so the kids could see that. But yeah, that's a dwarf. A dwarf will grow all season long. They actually can produce, not quite on the same level as some of the newer hybrids, but definitely on the level of some of the older heirlooms. It's just the stems are shorter. They still produce roughly the same number of flowers. So you still get quite a bit of fruit on a very small, compact, easy to handle plant. Micro dwarfs are the next stage. And the definition I'm going to give is the one I see with the micro dwarf tomatoes and others. But this kind of category of tomatoes is still pretty new, and there are some definitely different plants that still fall in there. I would say when you're talking about kind of anything smaller than a dwarf, you have a handful of indeterminate sort of trailing small plants that are grown for like little cherry tomatoes and stuff. Those are the ones you get in those planters that grow, they grow all year round, and they produce these long trails of tomatoes, but they don't tend to produce a ton of them over the course of the year. You just get a few of them. They're very visually striking, and they look nice on your patio, and it's really great if you have small space and you just need something to grow on the patio, but they don't really produce much more than just little, not always that great cherry tomatoes. And then the other category, and what the micro dwarf tomato project is focusing on, these are plants that have a similar thick stem to a dwarf tomato, but they are determinate and they don't get much taller than about 12 inches. And the great thing about that is you can grow a bunch of very small tomato plants in pots. And even though you're going to get, however many tomatoes it produces that season all in one little glut, and it's going to be a small plant, so it's not going to produce a ton. But you can grow multiple plants, you can succession plant, you can keep them coming. The real advantage is that all happens in one little pot. You can grow multiple varieties and not get overwhelmed with tomatoes the way some people do. Some people go out and they plant a dozen tomato plants. They're looking, very excitedly at having their tomatoes later in the year, and then they're having to give them away and find people to take them because they just have too many tomatoes. And with this, you can precision grow however many tomatoes you want. So I'm going to be playing with some micro dwarfs this year. I'm trying to get a hold of some. If you go to the Tomato Talk forum, I'll put a link in the show notes. They are occasionally able to send folks some seed to try and get more people to play around with these, to grow them, to fix the traits so that they can then pass these on to seed companies and actually have these become viable, self-sustaining varieties. So yeah, it's a really cool category of tomato to play around with, but you won't see a ton of seed with this. You'll sometimes see them put as mini or dwarf tomatoes even, because the term dwarf tomato hasn't become super uniform in the industry yet. And they're usually things like little Tom Thumb tomatoes and things like that. It's very broad. But if you look at some of the smaller growers who are taking from the dwarf tomato project, or the micro dwarf tomato project, we're beginning to see this form up as a category, and it's very exciting. I think so, at least. Jointless is a solution to a problem you sometimes see. When tomatoes have variable conditions, they will drop flowers. It's just the plant internally realizing it can't produce that much fruit. So the abscission points, those little joints you see on the tomato stem, they release the flower essentially. And this is when you get a lot of flower drop, and everybody, you pop on the internet and you're like, why is my tomato dropping the flowers? And invariably people point out that you're probably not watering it consistently, or your weather's been weird or whatever. And if you wait, it'll produce more and you'll be fine. Well, in a commercial environment, in a farm, they know how much they're going to provide at what time, when. So they don't want the plant to make those decisions for itself, because the plant may drop the flowers expecting that conditions just aren't right to produce the fruit. But the grower knows he's going to provide those conditions. Whatever little limitation it's seeing at the moment is going to be taken care of with the next application of fertilizer or the next watering or whatever. And so they bred them to be jointless, so the tomato can't drop its flowers on its own. The flowers can still fail to pollinate or develop and die. That still happens. But you don't get the ground covered in dropped tomato flowers just because the water wasn't quite what the tomato was expecting at that time. The indicators weren't just right for it, and so it dropped everything. That doesn't happen in jointless varieties. The upside is you can get a lot of fruit if you can provide reasonably stable conditions. If you don't provide reasonably stable conditions, the plant may overexert itself and die. So there's a downside to it. You can get a really ugly looking plant if it doesn't have good conditions, because it's going to produce its flowers like it normally does. It's going to produce fruit. It's going to produce fruit if they're pollinated. But if it can't grow those fruit without straining itself, it's going to start having some problems. So only do jointless varieties if you're pretty comfortable with growing tomatoes. The worst case that happens is you just have a tomato plant die. But I wouldn't focus on them unless you kind of know what you're doing. If you don't, stick to the jointed varieties. You'll have the frustration of flower drop occasionally, but you won't lose whole plants just because you didn't quite know what you were doing yet. So it's something to stay away from. Again, kind of like GMOs. It's something you don't see a whole lot outside of farming. You don't see a lot of jointless varieties in catalogs. There are a few, but you don't see a lot. So it's more common. But yeah, that's something just to be aware of. Beans have some similar situations. There's bush, and then you have your pole and vining beans. It's the same difference between the determinate and indeterminate. Bush beans have a determinate growth pattern. They will put out their beans at the end of their stalks at a given time after they've reached a certain size, and they'll die. And they're called bush because they form a little bush. They usually don't even need staking or trellising. They'll just form their bush, flower, produce a bunch of beans. You pick a bunch of beans, and the plant dies. The vining varieties are like indeterminate tomatoes. They'll sprawl everywhere, keep growing for as long as they can through the season, keep producing throughout the season. You won't get a glut, but you'll get it spread out. And they're really good, again, if you want that yield all year long. Most unimproved, I put big air quotes, you can't see around that, varieties we haven't intentionally bred for commercial agriculture. Most of those, the ones you're going to see as a gardener, are going to be vining varieties. But you do see quite a few bush beans as well. They're way more useful in commercial agriculture. But again, if you're going to plan succession plantings, if you're going to grow them in a very precise way, they can be very beneficial in your garden. Most people grow a few bush varieties. I'm growing a bush variety, which I'm going to plant in a few successions, and then I'm growing a trailing variety of long beans this year. So I'm hoping I can keep occasional large harvests for, big dinners and stuff from the soldier bean, the Thai soldier bean. And then from the more traditional red long bean, I just want that year-round supply. I'm not going to grow a ton of each, but I think weirdly doing something they do in commercial agriculture, which only works at scale, is actually going to benefit me at my small scale. Because if I grow several bush varieties in succession, then I can time them out, and I don't, I'm using roughly the same amount of space all year, but I'm getting yield after yield after yield. Now I'm going to have to put something back in that soil. The bacteria that beans form a symbiosis with, that's not going to do it for them entirely. I'm going to have to do something, but I should, between that and then the other, the pole variety, I should be able to have pretty consistent yields all year round with the occasional bounty, which should be really nice. I'll do a follow-up later on how that went. I don't think there's, cucumbers also now come in bush and trailing varieties as well. So let's go on to saving seed, because that's not something I'm going to cover entirely here, because that's way too much. I would recommend getting a good book on seed saving if you can, grabbing one from your library if you can, or just bending the ear of local seed savers if you can. Because different plants require different conditions for seed saving, and I'm not going to go over all those. What I am going to say is, one, when I posted this on social media over on Mastodon, somebody asked that she never knows how much seed to save. The correct answer is as much as you can save without driving yourself crazy trying to store it or handle it. You'll never regret saving seed, because next year you'll have it if you need it. If something doesn't grow, you'll have more seed. You can try again. If you have friends who want to try gardening, you can hand off the seed. You can do seed swaps and change the seeds you had too much of last year for the seeds you couldn't get a hold of last year. So there's no such thing as too much saved seed. Save as much as you can, with the caveat that you only do it if you are comfortable saving that much seed, if you're willing to put in that much work, because some varieties require more work than others. Sometimes you have to let a plant grow, and maybe you don't have the space to do that. I will probably never save carrot seed in my backyard, because the little postage stamp garden I'm working with right now does not have the space for me to allow a patch to go to seed the next year. The only exception is with carrots, I could take them, and I might take a few from one year, plant them around the rest of my garden in just the ornamental beds and stuff, and let them grow out as a flower, because they're very pretty when they flower. They look like Queen Anne's lace. And then after they're done flowering and they go to seed, save those seeds. Because carrots go dormant over the winter, you can just pull them up and plant them somewhere else. A few people I've heard of do this because umbellifers, the category of flower they are really good for pollinators. And so some people will actually buy the old sort of, starting to get soft carrots you see at the end of the day at a farmer's market. They'll buy them from, the organic growers. Some of the commercial ones you'll get have been sprayed with growth inhibitors. They're not toxic or really harmful to people, so don't worry too much about them, but they definitely mean you can't propagate from that material. Because you would have to wash off, which obviously you're going to wash it anyway, especially if you were going to eat it. You'd have to wash it off and then wait for that inhibitor to break down that's already in the plant. And the plant may not last that long. So yeah, it's buy organic ones if you're going to do that. But they'll get the organic ones that were going to get thrown away at the end of a day at the farmer's market, and they'll go plant those in their garden. And they'll bust out the next year with these big, flat, white flowers, the umbellifers, which are, lacy, big discs. And they'll just get swarmed by the local bees and insects and hoverflies and everything else. And it's kind of the best of both worlds. It's especially cool if you can get them really, really cheap or free. But yeah, so again, there's no such thing as too much saved seed. There's just too much for you maybe because of work, storage space, etc. The other question I got was, how old can seed be? That is a plant-by-plant question. Lettuce seed doesn't tend to have very long viability. Tomatoes can often last up to a decade if stored properly. The big thing is, no matter how long a seed can last, you're going to lose viability every single year. So if you're wanting to grow a bunch of varieties of tomato and you want to save your own seed and you want to engage in a little bit of breeding and you want to do a big scale tomato project, but you don't have a lot of land, if you're willing to leapfrog over years and grow a variety out 1 year and then not grow it again for 4 years or 5 years, whatever, you're just going to have to plant more seed to get the same amount of plant seed of the previous year, because some of that seed is not going to be viable and the viability will decrease every single year. Some plants hold it better than others. Some seeds have been found that have been viable after 1,000 years. And usually it took a lot of kind of chemical and fiddly trickery to get those to grow, like the lotus seeds they found in, I want to say, Egypt. But it's happened. Like, we've grown seed that is very, very, very old. But that doesn't mean all seed will last that long. A lot of seed doesn't. Some seed, like pawpaw seeds, don't last long at all. A pawpaw seed can't be allowed to dry out. That's why you don't see them that much. When you do buy them from people who actually sell them, you usually have to pay better shipping. They usually can't, last in shipping for a long time. They're usually in sealed, those kind of metally sealed containers to keep them preserved with the foil on the outside. And you have to plant them pretty much when you get them. And that's true for a handful of seeds. And those seeds are usually very regional products that you don't see everywhere. Pawpaws only made it to Australia because people kept trying to send them there, and eventually somebody got it through. This is why they invented the Wardian case. It was so you can get these kind of plants that can't be just dried out as seeds and shipped to places where you want them. So there are some plants that have low viability, some plants that have high. You'll have to look up by the plant. But generally speaking, for a lot of the seeds you have saved over from last year, you can probably grow those. Just sprinkle a few more seeds, just in case some of them aren't viable. But you can usually, for a couple of years, you're usually okay. Even though lettuce isn't usually that viable, I've grown lettuce that was, I don't know how old, because I found a cache of this stuff the second year I was working at my job, and it had probably been sitting on a back shelf there for at least another year beyond that, maybe more. And there was enough of it that I just used a ton of it, and we still got a decent lettuce harvest out of that. So yeah, you can use older seed. It's fine. Stores throw out last year's seed because they need to meet certain minimum viability requirements for the seed. It's how it's packaged and labeled and certified by the government. So if you grab some of that from a dumpster and they weren't kind of, jerks and threw bleach on it or something, they're fine. You can grow them. Some organizations will low-key donate those. They aren't technically supposed to because of the labeling, but they do it anyway. So that's okay. Seed companies used to do that for their donations. I don't know of any that do currently. Again, probably pursuant to those same labeling laws. They all pretty much sell their seed. Donate seed that is the same viability as the stuff they're selling that year. The one exception is you can see some really good sales towards the end of the year, just before the new stuff comes out for the seed catalogs in, winter. So kind of late mid-fall and sometimes early spring, you'll see stuff that is still within the calendar year that it was produced for, but is at the edge of that year. And you will see ridiculous sales on those. When you go onto those websites that are like, 50 cents a seed packet for bulk seeds. And if you buy, so many more, then it's another, quarter off or whatever. Those are usually stuff on that edge of viability. They're perfectly fine. You may need to use slightly more, but in most cases, they're within their range of viability. It's just labeling laws that prevent them from being sold properly the next year. They would have to completely relabel everything, recertify everything. It's a process that they don't want to go through, so they just toss them out. But you can recover those and use them. They're fine. So another thing I want to talk about really quick are things that aren't seeds. And this will be the end of this hour-long episode. It won't be an hour after I edit it. But anyway, it's an hour-long recording. It'll be 25 minutes when I'm done with it. Bulbs, bare root, all that. Potatoes, you can't grow from seed unless you are fiddling around with what are called true potato seed. But most of the commercial varieties that you're going to find like at the store and stuff, if you want to grow stuff like that, you're going to be doing that from other potatoes. You plant a potato to get potatoes. It's a miracle. Certified potato seed has been basically put through a whole process where they verify it doesn't have any diseases. They cut it down to very small propagatable parts. They grow that on a medium. Then they grow them out a couple more times to multiply them, and that's what they sell you. There's a lot of cool technology behind that, but most of it's still within the range of Rodale's organic labeling, because organic certified seed potato also exists. So you can still do that. Onions and garlic, kind of a mix. If you're doing from sets, onions are probably fine for spring. Garlic, you're a little late. You want to plant those in fall. If you plant them in spring, it's fine, but you're just going to get the tops, the greens for the most part. They won't bulb up very well. Garlic needs a winter to bulb up. So what you're going to want to do is either you can try stratification. You can try sticking it in a freezer for a while. There are instructions for that online. It's not super reliable and it's not really practical if you're growing a lot of it, but it's doable. I usually just plant it in fall, let it sit through the winter, and then it sprouts back up in spring and goes to bulb and you can pick it. It's fine. But yeah, it's a little late if you want to do those, but you can try it anyway. And if you just want to have garlic greens, if you just want to use the tops, it's perfectly fine. You can do that right now. You can plant those in the spring and then have them in late spring or summer as greens. That's totally okay. And the last thing I want to talk about goes back to the first thing I talked about. So you've got your seeds in your medium. They're growing. They put on their true leaves. What do you do now? A couple of options. One is if you did them in punnets, so they're all kind of split up individually, or at least only a couple plants per punnet, you can pull that whole thing out, put it in a bigger pot. That's called potting on. If you're going by the more sort of traditional way of growing plants that goes back quite a bit longer, then you have sowed all your seed in one big tray. And so once they get the leaves, you'll take a little stick. Chopsticks work great for this, so do little wood skewers. And you'll grab it by a true leaf, and you'll use the stick to work the roots loose. You'll pull each one out and put that in a pot and start it on to grow it out. And you probably will need to pot on once. Some commercial operations do it multiple times. It's usually for ornamentals, and it's because they keep all their stock in pots until you buy it. For your home operation, you're going to probably pot it on once into a bigger pot. That media does need to have some nutrition in the soil, so you're going to want to use an organic fertilizer, slow-release fertilizer, pelletized chicken manure, something mixed in with your potting mix to give it some nutrition so that plant can grow on. Because it's got its leaves now. It's ready to start photosynthesizing. It just needs those, vitamins, minerals, the nitrogen, potassium, needs all that stuff to grow. So that's when you can start on with the nutrition and everything. Usually they're not going to be in that situation long enough to need additional fertilizer. That said, I've seen organic setups where the medium doesn't contain any nutrition and they just flood them with a nutrient solution like hydroponics to get them growing. That's totally doable, but that's a little more than most people want to do. So just give it a little bit of fertilizer when you mix that new mix up, pot them on, let them grow out, and then plant them, right? Because the goal here, we're not talking about houseplant production or growing in containers right now. That's a different episode. Right now I'm just saying, get them all started, get them going, and then put them in the ground or wherever else you're going to put them. That's it. And that is the episode. That is all I had to say for today. As you noticed, I'm less worried about putting in my own beliefs about certain things and about telling people to do what they got to do, because I'm no longer going to try and make the perfect gardening show. I'm going to make my gardening show. And I lean a certain way politically, which is hopefully pretty obviously from the things I've said. And I'm going to say my things. So that's next year. That's me. I'm going to be me, telling you how to grow things, because I want everybody's life to be better. And this is one way to do that. So anyway, see you next year. Hopefully, assuming everything works out. I'll have a brand new website I'm working on. It will be much simpler for me to maintain, so it probably won't look nicer than what I have right now, but it'll be nicer for me because hopefully I'll be able to put more stuff up there. Anyway, you can catch all my stuff at tjsgarden.com. I also have a LibrePay account now, so you can pop in there if you want to help the show out, help me out, help me buy more plants and feed my addiction. And yeah, go out and enjoy your garden. Have a great day.